Hi, my name is Divya, and my poster is about oxytocin and its role in social behavior and mental illness. To start off, oxytocin is a nonapeptide hormone that is made up of 9 amino acids. Nonapeptide hormones are in the vasopressin family, so they are key regulators of water homeostasis and reducing urine output. Oxytocin is produced in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary. You may have heard of oxytocin before for its role in lactation and parturition or childbirth. This is because oxytocin triggers the letdown reflex to allow milk to be ejected from the breast. Oxytocin reduces anxiety, stress, and pain during labor, allowing the mother to be more relaxed and happy when she meets her baby. In a study done regarding maternal behavior, oxytocin antagonists were given to sheep and rat females, and they showed no maternal behavior. But sheep and rat females with no offspring showed maternal behavior with oxytocin infusion. So that just goes to show the role that oxytocin plays in maternal behavior. Non-social behaviors are also implicated with oxytocin, including learning, feeding, and pain perception. But the focus of this poster presentation is oxytocin's role in social behavior, and they can also be linked to psychological disorders, which is what I'll be talking about during this presentation. So in terms of social behavior, oxytocin receptors are all over different brain regions that are associated with stress, anxiety, and social behavior, particularly in the limbic system. So it is evident that oxytocin must play a role in these behaviors to some extent. There are 3 proposals made on how oxytocin can affect pro-social behaviors, pro-social meaning it benefits the individual or society. The first proposal is that oxytocin enhances attachment and trust. This is shown through pair bonding, motivation, and reward interactions, and increased positivity. Female prairie voles show partner preferences with oxytocin administration. Oxytocin receptors are also found in dopaminergic neurons and interact with the dopamine system. Oxytocin also increases the positivity of verbal and nonverbal communication in couples when there is a conflict. The second proposal is that oxytocin improves social memory. fMRI results of a study show that oxytocin administration is associated with processing facial expressions. Oxytocin knockout mice are also shown to not be able to recognize members of the same species after repeated encounters. So overall, oxytocin increases the accuracy of facial familiarity. Finally, the last proposal for how oxytocin influences social behavior is that oxytocin reduces fear. A study was done where the administration of oxytocin reduces amygdala activation, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for the fear response, and it increases parasympathetic function. So because oxytocin plays such a big role in social behavior, I hypothesize that it must also play a role with mental health disorders or psychological disorders, because a big part of mental health is interpersonal interactions. So in terms of oxytocin and mood disorders, a lot of clinical studies have tried to correlate oxytocin levels with depressive symptoms, but a lot of them have had inconclusive results or different results. One study showed that reduced oxytocin concentrations were observed in patients with major depressive disorder, but in future studies, no alterations were observed. Another study compared MDD patients with controls and found no difference in levels between the 2 groups, but there was more variation in the major depressive disorder group. Instead of correlating oxytocin with major depressive disorder as a whole, it may be correlated with individual symptoms of major depressive disorder, such as loss of interest in activities, feelings of sadness, or a lack of energy. For example, oxytocin is important in anxiolysis, which is reduced anxiety, and that can be a comorbidity with MDD or major depressive disorder. Another study shows that plasma oxytocin levels may be lower and more varied in women with major depressive disorder. Overall, study results are very varied as of now, but with further research, it's possible to have a clearer understanding of oxytocin's effects in major depressive disorder. So another group of common and well-studied mental health disorders that could be involved with oxytocin are anxiety disorders. It is shown that anxiety-driven and stressful situations activate the oxytocin system. There are more electrophysiological activity in oxytocin neurons and more gene expression in the hypothalamic superoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. Male rats exposed to stressful stimuli increases oxytocin release into the blood. A study was done where oxytocin knockout mice, female mice, show higher related behavior than the wild type, which coincides with the information presented earlier that oxytocin acts in an anxiolysis to reduce anxiety. High central oxytocin availability is also associated with pro-social behavior, whereas low oxytocin interaction shows social anxiety or being withdrawn from society. So similar to MDD, some of the evidence is definitely inconclusive, but it seems to be a little bit more coherent than the evidence for MDD. But as always, there's more research that can be done on this topic. So a fairly new field of research is potentially using oxytocin as treatment for these mental health or psychological disorders. Oxytocin is already used as treatment in terms of Pitocin during child labor, but in terms of mental health or social behavior treatments, this research is still pretty new. One study showed that oxytocin can have antidepressant-like effects, and oxytocin administration decreased the immobility time in a forced swim test in mice. Oxytocin administration also led to a positive hedonic state in rats and caused increased dopamine release, which suggested some reward properties. Oxytocin could also be used to reverse low social behavior in major depressive disorder patients. One big study was done where there were 15 parts where intranasal oxytocin was used as a potential treatment for anxiety and depressive disorders. They had individuals with social anxiety, arachnophobia, major depression, or postnatal depression treated with intranasal oxytocin. However, the results showed no significant effects on core symptomology, but a crossover study was done and fMRI results showed that there was reduced amygdala hyperactivity in the patients who had the intranasal oxytocin compared to the patients who did not have the intranasal oxytocin. So because this is fairly new, again, more testing does need to be done before anything can be released to the public or before there's any conclusive evidence. So in conclusion, oxytocin, while it's known for its impact in lactation and childbirth, has a very complex methodology for its effects on social behavior and mental health. There's a lot of evidence showing that oxytocin improves attachment, trust, social memory, and reduction of fear. And all of these are pro-social behaviors that seem to be linked with oxytocin in some way or the other. Research on oxytocin and psychological disorders are still fairly new and underdeveloped, so results are somewhat inconclusive, but it is evident that there is an effect of oxytocin somewhere. With the research available now, it seems like oxytocin is involved in reducing depressive symptoms and reducing anxiety symptoms. Using oxytocin as a treatment for conditions is also very promising, but fairly new and requires more testing. So as for questions from my presentation, one student asked if I could comment on which psychological disorder I believe to be the most closely linked with oxytocin. This is a really good question. But like I mentioned before, research is still pretty new on this topic. So I'm not sure which one would be the most closely linked because oxytocin receptors are in multiple parts of the brain, which can affect the brain and psychological health in very different ways. However, from the research that I have seen and read, the most common disorders associated with oxytocin are autism, schizophrenia, mood disorders such as MDD, and anxiety disorders. Another question that I received was if there are certain onset that triggers oxytocin imbalances, or are people just born with oxytocin imbalances? So like most imbalances and deficiencies, it can be a combination of genetic and environmental factors. So genetic factors, hormone imbalances, and even nutritional deficiencies are all potential causes of decreased oxytocin levels. Another note is that oxytocin and cortisol, which is the stress hormone, are very closely related. And so sometimes high stress or high cortisol can trigger the decrease of oxytocin levels. Finally, the last question that I received was if I found any certain treatments in the past that aren't used anymore, or if there are any new or modern medications that maybe weren't always around. So like I mentioned previously, oxytocin has been used as a treatment for labor as Pitocin for a long time to increase labor contractions. So that's definitely something that's been around for a really long time and is still used today. However, treatments for psychological disorders are not fully developed yet and are not fully tested yet. So those are definitely more modern and will take some time to be finalized. And maybe in the future, they will be treatments that are used that weren't used in the past. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.